All right, we have talked about what's in Article 3. We're starting to get an idea of the powers or whatever, the role of the courts according to the Constitution. But now we got to start going beyond the Constitution to figure out what the courts can do, what kind of power they have. So let's talk about judicial review. We'll talk about the power that the courts use. In the picture here, we see Chief Justice John Roberts. We see the Supreme Court in the background. You might see Clarence Thomas hiding over there. So we'll be talking about some judges. We'll be talking about decisions made by the court and how that has changed the court's power. All right, there is our friend Chief Justice John Marshall. Not the very first Chief Justice, but the first important Chief Justice. So we're going way back to the 1800s here to talk about a court case that I am positive you know from your history classes. But we're going to talk about Marbury versus Madison. So Marbury versus Madison, we don't really care about the story a whole lot here, but what happened is right before the presidents were about to change, the president tried to appoint a lot of judges like last night in office. These are called midnight judges or whatever. The Marbury, in this case, was trying to get the Supreme Court to issue a writ of mandamus, which is a part when a court orders another part of government to do something. And so the Supreme Court, or the court he was asking the court, hey, can you make this other part of the government do something? Now, John Marshall, the Chief Justice, and the other judges on the Supreme Court took a look at this request and decided that the court doesn't have that power. Not only does the court not have that power, but the Judiciary Act of 1789 said that the court had that power, but Article 3 of the Constitution does not. And so John Marshall says, like, he wasn't asked this question, but he says the Judiciary Act of 1789 conflicts with what Article 3 says. And so they struck down the Judiciary Act of 1789. And this is the first time that the Supreme Court took a look at what another branch of government did and said, you can't do that. So this is our first instance of judicial review. This case established the precedent of judicial review. So this is a super important case. We don't worry about the details all that much, but what we worry about is this is the case that gave the federal courts a job, and that job is judicial review. So because of Marbury versus Madison, for the first time, we have the courts telling another branch of government, you did something that violated the Constitution, and you can't do that. So this is the important Marbury versus Madison case that sets up judicial review. All right, so what exactly does judicial review mean? This is when the courts look at actions of other parts of the government. It could be the president, Congress, bureaucracy, states, local governments, whatever, any other part of the government. And they determine if that part of the government acted in a way that is constitutional or is not. So they determine whether or not that action is okay. When a law and the Constitution come into conflict, like any law, remember the Constitution, Article 6 says is the highest law of the land. So if a law conflicts with the Constitution, that law is no longer a law. The Supreme Court will look at that law and say, actually, this law violates the Constitution, so it can't be a law. And this gives the courts the power to determine how much power the whole government has. So if the government does something and the courts decide we shouldn't be able to do that because of what the Constitution says, then that is not a power of the government anymore. So this judicial review, this is the check that the courts have on the other parts of the government. When we did the Congress and President, we went through a long list of checks that they have on different parts of the government. There's nothing for the courts in what we talked about in Article 3. Marbury versus Madison created the idea of judicial review. When the courts did it for the first time, now the courts have a role and a power. And that role is to monitor the other parts of the government and to tell them when they've acted unconstitutionally or when what they've done is okay. All right, so thinking about judicial review, it is the duty of the courts, like it's their job, their role, to interpret and apply the Constitution. So they have to determine if something that happened in the government, if there is a conflict between that law and the Constitution. We do not have to read Federalist 71, but Federalist 71 explains that this is what courts would do. So even though judicial review is not specifically in the Constitution, remember that those people who wrote the Constitution wrote the Federalist Papers. And so this lets us know that this is what they expected the court to do. This gives us an idea that the court in Marbury versus Madison, they didn't just create this idea or invent something brand new, but they were exercising a power that many people argued that the courts would have. So Marbury versus Madison, when Marbury versus Madison was decided, that gave the Supreme Court a new role in monitoring what the other parts of the government do. This is super important. Marbury versus Madison, probably our most important court case of all the ones that we have to learn here. So they struck down something that another branch of government did. They told another branch of government, no, you can't do that. Then they didn't do that for a long time. They did not tell the government that they didn't have that power again all the way until the Dred Scott case. And we'll end up talking about that way later. But that's about 50 years of not saying no to the government. What's important to remember about judicial review, we've said that judicial review is when they decide if it is constitutional or not. It's very important that you remember that judicial review does not automatically mean strike down. Judicial review does not always mean that the court is saying no. Most of the time, the court is looking at the action of another branch and they say, okay, that's fine. But judicial review does not automatically mean no. All right, we will be talking about judicial review a lot over the next few days. This is the main power of the court. This is how the court exercises control of the other branches. So we will be talking about this a lot. We are definitely not done with this, but it is so important that you remember how Marbury versus Madison was the first time this was used. And this created an example, and this gave the courts a job to do, and this gave the courts a power over the other branches. But let's remember with judicial review that this is where the courts are determining if what another part of the government did is okay. They might say yes, they might say no, but it is the court's job to decide how that went. So we've talked about judicial review. We need to get a little bit of basic court vocabulary in our notes here so that we know how to use it, and then we can move forward talking about the different roles of the court.